winter in Rogers Pass doesn't arrive. It descends like a siege, turning one of the most treacherous stretches of mountain railway in North America into something closer to a frozen battlefield. Between November and April, avalanches thunder down the Selkirk Mountains with the regularity of a metronome, burying track, obliterating snowsheds, and crushing anything caught in their path. For the men who ran the Canadian Pacific Railway through this gauntlet in the early 20th century, survival meant constant vigilance, backbreaking labor, and locomotives purpose-built to claw through snow that could swallow a two-story building. And yet, in a graveyard of forgotten machinery scattered across the Columbia River Valley, one locomotive still exists. Not in a museum, not restored to gleaming perfection, but there, rusting, half-buried, slowly dissolving into the landscape that tried so hard to kill it. Its designation was Canadian Pacific 226, a rotary snowplow locomotive. Built in 1913, it spent 40 years battling through drifts that would have stopped anything else on rails. By the time the railway abandoned Rogers Pass in 1916 and retreated into the Connaught Tunnel beneath the mountains, most of its siblings had already been scrapped, sold, or repurposed. But 226 stayed, and when the railway finally gave up on maintaining snow removal equipment in the abandoned pass, 226 was left behind, not as a memorial, but as industrial debris too heavy and remote to bother moving. What keeps a machine alive when everything around it dies? That's the question worth asking, because 226's survival wasn't intentional. It was accidental, the byproduct of geography, economics, and sheer mechanical stubbornness. This is the story of the only locomotive that outlasted Rogers Pass, not through glory, but through abandonment. To understand why 296 mattered, you need to understand what Rogers Pass demanded. When the Canadian Pacific Railway punched through the Selkirk Mountains in 1885, completing the transcontinental line that would bind Canada together, engineers knew they were building through terrain that bordered on suicidal. Rogers Pass, named for Major A.B. Rogers, who surveyed the route, sat at 4,134 feet elevation in a range notorious for avalanches. The pass itself was narrow, steep, and hemmed in by peaks rising another 3,000 feet on either side. Snowfall didn't accumulate in feet, it accumulated in stories. The railway's solution was to build snow sheds, miles of timber roofing cantilevered over the tracks to deflect avalanches. By 1910, there were over 5 miles of continuous snowshed coverage through the worst sections. Walk through Rogers Pass during winter, and you'd spend more time inside wooden tunnels than in open air. The sheds worked mostly, but they were expensive to maintain, flammable, and couldn't stop the snow from piling up on the tracks themselves. Drifts, 20, 30, even 40 feet deep would form between the sheds, blocking the line completely. That's where rotary plows came in. Unlike a wedge plow which just pushes snow aside, useless in deep drifts, a rotary plow ate snow. The front end housed a massive rotating fan blade, 10 feet in diameter, driven by a separate steam engine built into the plow itself. As the locomotive pushed the unit forward, the blades would chew into the drift, pulling snow into the center and firing it out through a discharge chute that could swivel to direct the stream anywhere from straight ahead to 90 degrees to either side. The result was a moving snow cannon capable of cutting through drifts that would stop a conventional locomotive cold. But here's the catch. Rotaries were specialized, expensive, and needed dedicated locomotives to push them. The plow unit itself had no traction. It was a tool. The real muscle came from the locomotive behind it, often 2 or 3 engines coupled together, feeding steam into the rotary's mechanism while simultaneously shoving the entire assembly forward through resistance that could spike to dozens of tons per foot. Canadian Pacific 226 was one of those workhorses. Built by the Canadian Locomotive Company in Kingston, Ontario, It was a 2-8-0 consolidation type, 8 driving wheels, no leading or trailing trucks, designed for raw pulling power at low speeds. It weighed 170,000 pounds, generated 36,000 pounds of tractive effort, and burned through coal at a rate that would have bankrupted a less desperate operation. Factory records listed it as D10 class, one of 75 near-identical engines delivered between 1905 and 1913 specifically for mountain service. On paper, 226 was unremarkable. In the Rogers Pass winter, it was essential. The men who operated 226 and its rotary plow worked in conditions that defy comfortable description. A typical snow removal run would begin in Revelstoke, the division point at the western foot of the Selkirks. The crew, usually 8 to 10 men, split between the locomotive and plow, would board before dawn, checking steam pressure, oil levels, coal supply, and 100 other details that meant the difference between success and catastrophe. The rotary itself needed its own fireman to maintain steam for the cutting head. Communication between the plow and the locomotive relied on a system of bell signals and, when visibility allowed, hand gestures. Moving through Rogers Pass in winter meant navigating a landscape that seemed actively hostile to mechanical intrusion. The track climbed 2.2% grades, steep enough that a heavy freight train would struggle even in summer. Add snow, ice, and the need to push a multi-ton plow through resistance measured in the thousands of pounds, and you're operating machinery at the absolute edge of its design limits. Temperature was a separate enemy. Winter nights in the pass regularly dropped below -30 Fahrenheit. Steam lines froze. Lubricating oil thickened into sludge, metal contracted, joints loosened, seals failed. Crews kept fires burning in the locomotive's firebox around the clock, even when stationary, because letting the boiler cool could mean hours of work just to build steam pressure again. And then there were the avalanches. Rogers Pass in winter was, and remains, one of the most avalanche-prone locations in North America. Slides could occur with no warning, triggered by temperature shifts, wind loading, or simple accumulation of unstable snow layers. A rotary plow crew pushing through a drift had no way of knowing if the slope above them was about to let go. Lookouts stationed on high points would try to spot dangerous conditions, but in blizzard conditions or at night, that system broke down completely. The railway kept records of every major slide that hit the line. Between 1885 and 1910, avalanches killed dozens of workers. The worst single incident occurred in March 1910 when a slide near the Avalanche Mountain snowshed buried a work crew attempting to clear an earlier slide. 62 men died. That disaster accelerated CPR's decision to bore the Connaught Tunnel, a 5-mile passage beneath Rogers Pass that would bypass the worst avalanche zones entirely. Construction began in 1913, the same year 226 was built. By 1916, the tunnel was complete, and the CPR rerouted all mainline traffic through it. The original line over Rogers Pass, with its snow sheds, stations, and steep grades, was abandoned. For most locomotives, abandonment meant reassignment. Engines were valuable assets, easily moved to other divisions where mountain power was needed. But snow removal equipment was different. Rotary plows and their dedicated pushing engines were specialized for a problem that no longer existed once the tunnel opened. The railway had dozens of them scattered across the system, Revelstoke, Field, Donald, and no pressing need to keep them all. 226 was among the surplus. What happened next is where the story gets strange. Standard practice would have been to send 226 to the scrapyard. Locomotives had a finite service life, and by the 1920s, railways were already phasing out older designs in favor of heavier, more efficient power. But scrapping required effort. You had to move the engine to a facility equipped to dismantle it, cut it apart, and sell the metal. For a locomotive sitting in a remote mountain division, that meant committing crews, fuel and track time to haul dead weight. 226 stayed in Revelstoke for a while. Records show it was used sporadically for yard switching and local freight work, tasks well below its original purpose, but sufficient to justify keeping it fueled. By the mid-1920s, though, even that stopped. The locomotive was shunted onto a siding, its fire dropped, steam pressure bled off, and responsibility for its fate quietly forgotten. This is the paradox of industrial abandonment. Things survive not because they're valued, but because they're overlooked. For locomotives, the 1930s and 40s were a period of mass extinction. The Great Depression gutted railway revenues, forcing aggressive cost-cutting. Anything that didn't earn its keep was scrapped. World War II created enormous demand for scrap metal, and thousands of obsolete steam engines were melted down to feed the war effort. By 1950, steam itself was dying, displaced by diesel-electric locomotives that were cheaper to maintain and didn't need the vast support infrastructure of coal, water, and skilled firemen. Yet 226 remained. Part of the explanation is geographic. Revelstoke, while strategically important, was isolated. Scrap dealers operating in Vancouver or Calgary weren't making special trips into the mountains for a single locomotive when easier pickings existed closer to population centres. Moving 226 would have required a functioning locomotive to haul it, an expense the railway had no incentive to incur. But there's another factor. 226 wasn't just sitting on a siding. At some point, records don't specify when, it was moved onto an abandoned section of the old Rogers Pass line. Not the main track, which had been pulled up for scrap during the 1920s, but a spur that had served one of the snow shed maintenance camps. This was track that led nowhere, hidden in the forest, kilometers from active railway operations. Whether this was intentional storage or simple dumping is unclear. What's certain is that it placed 226 outside the normal flow of railway activity, out of sight, out of mind, and out of reach of scrap dealers. Decades passed. The forest reclaimed the old Rogers Pass right-of-way. Snow sheds collapsed, trestles rotted. The railway itself, now fully committed to diesel power and modern infrastructure, had no reason to think about equipment abandoned 40 years prior. 226 sat where it had been left, slowly oxidizing. Rain dissolved paint, exposing bare iron to the elements. Rust bloomed across the boiler shell, driver wheels and running gear. Seals rotted, lubrication dried out. Small animals nested in the cab. Moss grew in the spaces between frame components. The locomotive was decomposing, but not quickly. Cast iron and wrought steel don't vanish overnight. They erode, layer by molecular layer, and that process, especially in the relatively dry climate of interior British Columbia, can take a century or more. By the 1960s, when railway heritage preservation was becoming a serious movement in Canada, 226 was already too far gone to interest most museums. Preservation groups preferred locomotives in restorable condition, with complete running gear, intact boilers, and some hope of eventual operation. 226 had none of that. It was a hulk, historically significant perhaps, but practically worthless, and yet it kept existing. The modern story of 226 begins with hikers. The construction of the Trans-Canada Highway through Rogers Pass in 1962 brought the first sustained tourist presence to the area since the railway's abandonment. Hikers exploring the forested slopes began finding relics, sections of rail, pieces of snowshed timber, rusted spikes, and eventually a locomotive. Its location was, and remains, deliberately vague in most published accounts, partly to prevent vandalism and partly because reaching it requires navigating rough terrain with no maintained trail. But enough people have seen it over the years that its existence is well documented. Photographs from the 1970s show 226 still largely intact, though heavily weathered. By the 1990s, the cab had partially collapsed and the smokestack had toppled. More recent images show advanced decay, with the boiler beginning to buckle and vegetation growing through the frame. It's tempting to see Toon 26 as a monument, a survivor, the last of its kind still in situ rather than preserved under glass or scrapped into oblivion. But that romanticizes what is fundamentally an accident. Toon 26 survived because no one cared enough to destroy it. Its continued existence is a function of inertia, not intention. Still, there's something worth recognizing in that. Most of the locomotives that worked Rogers Pass are gone, not just scrapped but erased, melted back into raw material, reborn as cars, bridges, weapons, appliances. Their labor was essential, their existence temporary. They were tools built for a purpose, and when that purpose ended, so did they. Toon 26 escaped that fate not through superiority, but through irrelevance. It was too remote to scrap efficiently, too deteriorated to restore, too ordinary to lionize, and in being overlooked, it achieved a kind of immortality unavailable to machines deemed valuable. What does that tell us about preservation? About memory? We save the famous locomotives, the record breakers, the elegant passenger engines, the experimental prototypes. We restore them, house them in climate-controlled museums, and present them as representatives of their era. But 226 represents something those polished examples can't: the ordinary, the utilitarian, the machinery that did brutal, necessary work in places no one remembers. It's still out there, somewhere in the forests above the Trans-Canada Highway, slowly returning to the earth. Rust flakes into the soil, rain pools in the firebox, moss softens the hard edges of cast iron. In another 50 years it may be unrecognizable. In 100, perhaps only a mound of oxidized metal, indistinguishable from the rocks around it. But for now, it endures, not as a monument, as a ghost. The only locomotive that survived Rogers Pass did so by being forgotten. And in that forgetting, it became the most honest memorial to the men and machines that fought that mountain, not celebrated, not romanticized, just there. Weathering, enduring, waiting for the snow. There's a broader pattern here beyond one rusting locomotive in the British Columbia wilderness. The machinery we preserve tells a selective story. Museums are full of firsts, bests, and mosts. The first diesel, the fastest steamer, the most powerful engine. These are legitimate artifacts worthy of care, but they're also outliers. They represent ambition, achievement, the moments when engineering reached beyond itself. What they don't represent is the daily grind, the routine brutality, the thousands of ordinary machines that kept systems running without fanfare or recognition. 226 was never supposed to be special. It was one of 75 near-identical engines built to a standardized design assigned to do dirty work in a place most people would never see. Its crews weren't heroes. They were railway workers doing a dangerous job for wages, showing up in the dark, shoveling coal, watching pressure gauges and hoping the slope above them stayed stable. When the job ended, they moved on. When the locomotive was no longer needed, it was left behind. And somehow, in being left behind, it became singular. Every other D10 class locomotive that worked Rogers Pass is gone. They were useful, so they were worked until they broke, then cut apart and recycled. Their utility guaranteed their destruction. 226's uselessness guaranteed its survival. There's an irony in that worth sitting with. Visit Rogers Pass today and you'll find the Trans-Canada Highway cutting through the same terrain the railway once traversed. The Parks Canada Visitor Centre tells the story of the CPR's mountain struggle with displays, photographs and artifacts. You can see sections of snow-shed timber, preserved rail spikes and explanatory plaques describing the engineering challenges. It's well done, informative and sanitized in the way public history often is. 226 isn't there. It's out in the forest, inaccessible to most visitors, unmarked and slowly disintegrating. No interpretive panel explains its significance. No preservation society maintains it. It exists in a liminal state between artifact and geology, still recognizable as a locomotive, but increasingly indistinguishable from the landscape consuming it. Should someone save it? The question is harder than it sounds. Restoration would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly more. You'd need to clear access to the site, stabilize the remains, disassemble what's left, transport it somewhere with the facilities to do preservation work, and then rebuild it to a standard that justified the expense. Even then, what would you have? A locomotive that was never particularly notable, restored to represent a railway line that no longer exists, commemorating work that ended over a century ago. Is that worth the cost? Or is there value in leaving it exactly where it is, decaying, forgotten, honest? The thing about industrial ruins is that they tell truths polished artifacts can't. A restored locomotive in a museum speaks to what we want to remember: technological progress, human ingenuity, the romance of steam and steel. A rusting hulk in the forest speaks to what actually happened. Machines were built, they worked until they couldn't, and then they were discarded. The wilderness reclaimed the railway, the mountain won. That's not a triumphant narrative. It's not one that fits comfortably into heritage preservation frameworks that prefer stories of achievement and legacy, but it's accurate. And sometimes accuracy matters more than comfort. Rogers Pass defeated the railway. The CPR's original route over the summit lasted 31 years before the company gave up and tunneled beneath the mountains. The snow sheds rotted, the stations were abandoned, the equipment was scrapped or left behind. Nature reasserted itself with the patient inevitability of geological time. 226 is what remains when the heroic narrative ends. It's the epilogue no one wanted to write, the coda after the story was supposed to be over. And in that role it's irreplaceable. So what do we do with that? Maybe nothing. Maybe the right answer is to let 226 continue its slow dissolution, unmarked and unmourned, until it's completely gone. There's honesty in that, accepting that not everything needs to be saved, that some stories are better told by absence than presence. Or maybe someone, someday, will decide it's worth documenting more thoroughly. Not to restore, but to record, to create a detailed archive of what's there before it vanishes completely. Laser scans, photographs, measurements, a digital ghost of a physical ghost. Both approaches have merit. Both respect what 226 has become, not a functioning machine, not a museum piece, but evidence. Proof that the struggle through Rogers Pass was real, that the locomotives that fought that winter were tangible, and that some remnants of that era persist outside institutional control. Winter still comes to Rogers Pass. Avalanches still roar down the Selkirk slopes, though now they're monitored by Parks Canada artillery crews who trigger them with howitzers before they threaten the highway. The Connaught Tunnel, modernized and double-tracked, carries freight trains through the mountain every day. The railway won, in the end, by admitting defeat and going around the problem. Somewhere above the highway, buried in forest that grows thicker every year, 226 waits. Snow falls on its boiler. Rain pools in its firebox. Rust continues its patient work. And the mountain, indifferent to machinery and memory alike, simply exists. The only locomotive that survived Rogers Pass did so by becoming part of the landscape it once fought. Not preserved, not celebrated, just there. Is that enough? Or does every piece of history deserve active protection regardless of cost or significance? I don't have an answer, but I think the question matters, because how we remember the ordinary machinery of the past, the unglamorous, unexceptional tools that did essential work, shapes how we understand the systems they served and the people who depended on them. Tune 26 wasn't special, but it's what's left. And in a world that tends to forget anything that wasn't first, best, or most, maybe that makes it worth remembering after all. What do you think? Does abandonment have its own kind of value? Or are we losing something irreplaceable every time we let history dissolve into the forest floor?